Hey guys, this is Moo Power here doing a tutorial video on Protoss versus Terran. And here I wanted to show you guys how I organize my hotkeys, because learning your hotkeys and getting comfortable with your own setup is very crucial to being a competent player in this game. Or it's a lot easier, at least, because all the pro gamers in this game, they have their own set of hotkeys that they're comfortable with. What I mean by their own hotkeys is not only the alphabets that they type when it comes to certain buildings or units, but how they organize their control groups, which I'll be explaining a bit later. But here, I don't know if you noticed in the beginning of the game, I saved my screen location. So there's two different ways of hotkeying. Well, actually, there's three types of hotkeying. There's obviously your commands that you just learn what to hotkey. I mean, the commands that you give your units, they have certain hotkeys. So if you select your probe and you type B, and then that's for build, and you can build a gateway or pylon. So you type BP and then you plant it wherever you want, and that's how you instantly build, rather than jump, like scrolling your mouse over to that 9 square bit on the right bottom corner where you can technically press the button instead with your mouse, but that just wastes precious seconds, and in a battle or when you're doing something important, that's just taking away, focus from what's truly important. So I think hotkeys definitely make your life a lot easier and accomplishing a lot more. So here, after I send my probe, I hotkey my first probe as 1, and then later I may reassign that number 1 to my first group of units. But for now, my probe is set as 1, and that's how I'm instantly able to switch back and forth to my probe and to my main building. My first nexus is hotkeyed as 0, because 0 on the keyboard is next to P. So all I've got to do is type 0 and then P, and then my nexus will build a probe without me physically or manually having to click on the nexus and going back to that screen. But I still go to the main screen of the nexus anyways, just to see what's going on, or just to practice, spamming, I guess. But technically you could just click on the nexus and then click on the probe button, but that'll take way too long. And then so yeah, that's what I'm doing. I just scouted the Terran base. Now this is a computer, obviously it's not going to do a viable strategy, but I'm going to just still practice as if this was a real opponent. Now if you notice there, I selected one of the gas probes to get off the gas because I want to do a fast expand build. So that kind of decreases my gas rate a little bit in favor of slightly more minerals a little quicker. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't make a huge difference, but I think it helps you get that nexus just a few seconds faster. So yeah, I usually get the nexus around 21 supply, and then as I selected that nexus, I assigned it as 9. So I kind of reverse order the nexus, and then my units are in order. So my first 3 nexuses are going to be hotkeyed as 0, 9, and 8. After those 3 nexuses, it's not really important to hotkey your main nexuses anymore, because you're kind of in your mid to late game, which you're going to be almost finished with producing probes for the most part, unless you got harassed and you lost a lot of workers. But generally you want to start focusing more on unit production at the mid to late stages. So that's why I hotkey the first 3 nexuses, and then after that it's not a huge deal. I can just click on the minimap to where the new nexus bases are, and then just make more probes if I need to. And then my army composition, I hotkey my first group of dragoons or first group of units as 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and possibly 8, but usually it goes up to 7 and I'm maxed out. because at the end game you should have around anywhere from 60 to 70 probes, and then the rest should be your population for your army. So if you think about it, you've got roughly 70 probes, and then the rest of the 130 population out of 200 is going to be in units. So that's why 1 through 6 or 7 is usually sufficient for all your army needs as Protoss. It's going to be a little different with Zerg and Terran because they have more units potentially. But yeah, that's how I kind of organize it. Now, the reason why I skipped 2 is because 2 is going to be organized as my flying units or shuttles, or if I'm playing Terran, it's going to be dropships. So that's kind of how it makes sense for me. Like I'll hotkey the flying unit or shuttle as 2, so that way I don't even have to think about it. I know that 2 is always going to be that unit or that type of unit. So just hotkey whatever makes sense for you. This just makes sense for me because it's really easy for me to just remember, like if I want to attack with my whole army, I can just go 1A click, 3A click, 4A, 5A, 6A, 7A, and just click on the map, and then I'll have my entire army attack within a few seconds of all those commands. And imagine doing that, but without the hotkeys. You have to manually select 12 at a time and move them. It's just a headache. So that's why it's better to just go 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A, 5A. Well, 2A's for shuttles or flying units, but you get the idea. So here, you notice how I instantly transition back to my dragoons, and notice how I'm multitasking while this is going on. I'm not paying attention to the battle because I'm retreating, because I just clicked on the minimap for them to retreat to, and then here I'm just pulling back the injured dragoons or the dragoons that are getting focused on, and that way they survive a lot longer and they can recharge their shields. And then as soon as I'm kind of finished with that battle, I don't keep paying attention to it. I do whatever's necessary and constantly multitask. And you see here how I deselected those 2 dragoons. I selected the 2 most injured ones to kind of defend my base and keep my most healthy dragoons out in the front to kind of survey the map and potentially attack if necessary. But to defend against drops, you want to keep a few dragoons at your other bases to make sure vultures don't just, slaughter your probes. So you see there how I kind of blocked the ramp with those 2 dragoons. That's a pretty smart thing to do and just make a habit of. And then notice how I'm constantly just cycling through those 3 nexuses. So I go 0P, select probe, 9P, 8P, and then I just select the probes when they're finished building. And then I go BP, pylon, I just constantly just start building stuff, making sure I'm constantly building dragoons too. So tip number 1, just constantly building probes, 0P, 9P, 8P for your nexuses, and then your gateways. So you see that main screen where you saw those 4 gateways in the middle? That is my screen saved location of F3. I just assigned it as F3. That makes most sense for me. So whatever screen location you want, like F2 or F4 or F3, whatever makes sense, you can just do that. I just saved that for my gateways, so I know F3 is always going to be in the middle of my gateway buildings. That way I can just type F3, go back to my gateways, and then make more dragoons, and then F2 to select the dragoons that are already finished and at the rally point. So that's kind of what I'm doing here, and I'm just constantly scouting the map, making sure my opponent is not expanding or doing something sneaky. And yeah, I know this is a computer, but you just want to practice as if this is a real opponent. That way this practice is more meaningful rather than you just sitting back because it's a computer. And my macro this game was actually pretty decent. I'm at 121 supply at 9 minutes and 30 seconds. That's pretty good macro because, well, first of all, I'm playing against a computer, so I can pretty much do whatever I want. because I know what the computer does every time, and I can counter it without too much trouble. With those Marines, I didn't really suffer any casualties. So yeah, other than preparing for your opponent, try to macro as heavily as you can, and it's all about just taking risks, a calculated risk. You don't want to get too greedy and get punished for it, but you just want to get by just barely enough to where you can get away with, building that many buildings, or investing in your economy. So that's pretty much what's going through my head when I'm doing these things. And notice how my minerals and gas are kind of stacked up at almost 1,000. That's a sign that you need to build more gateways. So that's why I'm building more gateways right now, because you see here I've got 3 bases up. So that number of bases, or that kind of economy, can support this many gateways. Because if you produce from 4 gateways non-stop, you'll still have so much money left over if you only build 4 gateways at this point. So it's a good idea to, once you start noticing your minerals and gas stacking up, that's a sign that, hey, I need to get more buildings, need to expand more, take advantage of that resources that you have acquired, and kind of snowball from there. Because if you're in an economic lead, you want to snowball that and make sure your opponent can't get back. So that's the way you do it. If I was playing against a lesser Terran and they allowed me to macro back up, this is what I would do. If they had poor macro, even if they had an edge, this is how I would beat them, is because I have better macro. I can hotkey all my units. I can do things a lot quicker without having to manually do stuff. So you see how all those gateways are being rallied to that central location where all of them can just be control grouped into a new group of units. So yeah, that's pretty much what's going on. And so the full army that I usually like to go with is 1 and 3 is my 2 full control groups of dragoons once I get to that point. And then 4 is always going to be just zealots. So if you saw right there, I quickly selected my army, and you saw like a quick flash of all the units that were selected. So yeah, so 1, 3 is 2 full control groups of dragoons. 2 is going to be my shuttle or whatever flying unit, and then 4 is going to be my group of zealots, and then 5 is like a mix of dragoons and zealots and high templars, and then 6 is the same thing, and then 7 is the same thing. So essentially, the reason why I always emphasize the first 2 control groups of dragoons is because in the Terran matchup, you constantly are going to sweep mines with your dragoons. So obviously dragoons have range, so they can defuse the mines without taking any damage, whereas zealots have to attack them as melee units. You can suicide some zealots to kind of clear them away, but to kind of do that efficiently, you want to have a control group of dragoons with an observer, so you can clear the mines for your army to kind of move around without any hiccups. So yeah, see, my minerals are still high, so I'm getting more and more gateways. I'm expanding pretty aggressively, taking more and more of the map. And my computer Terran friend here is not doing anything. So I pretty much can take advantage of his passive kind of play style and just keep building more stuff. And eventually, in a real Protoss versus Terran matchup, the Terran will run out of resource, or you'll start to run out of resources in the map. And when that happens, you're kind of fighting for map control, because whoever has control of those bases that are left with resources, you're eventually going to starve out your opponent, and they're going to have more units than you because they have more resources to rebuild. And that's kind of how the cookie crumbles at the end when you have map control. So you see here, like, I have pretty much vision of the entire map, the only places I don't really have vision is the top right corner and the bottom middle area, which is, you don't want to expand over there next to Terran because Terran has siege tanks. So in Protoss versus Terran, you always want to kind of expand further from the Terran, because siege tanks are just OP in that sense. You kind of want some distance and push the Terran as far as back as possible, but in the meantime, you don't want to, be choked to death with siege tanks, in front of your bases, because Terran is like this pretty fortified type of race where they're so great at defending cost efficiently versus Protoss. Protoss has to have more expansions than the Terran, and in this matchup it's not unusual for the Protoss to be up 3 bases. That's like sometimes normal. Usually though, a good rule of thumb is Terran wants to be at least or Protoss wants to be at least 1 base ahead, but if they're like 2 to 3 bases ahead, that's usually a good sign. But sometimes even if Protoss is 2 to 3 bases ahead, sometimes the Terran units just survive much longer than the Protoss units, because siege tanks do a lot of damage. You kind of have to just suicide a lot of zealots to get something done, and then you kind of whittle down the Terran army. Once you whittle down the Terran army, you just constantly reinforce that attack, and eventually if you've done enough damage to their army, then you can kind of push back their attack. So yeah, in a one-on-one fight, or maxed out army versus maxed out army, Terran is going to win. The reason Protoss can compete is their sheer number of production and tech units. That's how they kind of battle. So that's why it's very important as Protoss to stay 1 base ahead and constantly build gateways. So you see here at the top left, if you see on the minimap, there, right there, so I have 5 gateways currently. So you want to have like a second full group of gateways. At my main base, I believe I have 15 gateways. So with those added, I have 20 plus gateways. So 20 plus gateways will give me 40 supply every 40 seconds. 40 or so seconds, because each, like dragoons are like what, 40 seconds, zealots are 30 seconds. So roughly 40 seconds on average, you're resupplying your population by 40. So imagine a big battle. Terran takes you down back to 130, which is very, it happens a lot, where I basically lose 2/3 of my army and have to pull back. Otherwise the Terran will just roll out and then just go siege right up to my bases, and that's a position you don't want to be in. You want to push the Terran back enough, but if they're gonna survive with not enough casualties, then you just don't want to attack that kind of fortified position. You want to attack when the Terran is either moving and they're not sieged yet, where they're most vulnerable, because the difference between siege mode and regular tank mode is huge. Siege mode is 70 damage and tanks do 30 damage. So once they're moving and they're trying to push out, then that's the perfect time for the Protoss to just smother the Terran and attack. It's like I don't know, like a panther waiting to pounce. Right when the Terran is sieging or about to siege, that's where you want to pounce on the Terran. And that's the kind of I mean, you won't always have that opportunity, but that's like the best opportunity you have, because think about it, like you have to get your units in position to attack the siege tanks, and siege tanks have further range than all of your units, so some of them are going to die before you even get to attack them.